There is a sentence that has quietly kept billions of people poor. Not a bad investment, not a failed business, not bad luck. A single sentence, 3 words. And the worst part, most people say it dozens of times every single day without ever realizing what it is costing them. The sentence is this: I can't afford it. Now stay with me, because I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, if I genuinely don't have the money, what else am I supposed to say? And that question, that exact question, is the answer. That is precisely what Jewish millionaires have been teaching their children for over 3,000 years. Not in schools, not in synagogues, not in any book that was ever handed to the general public, quietly, at the dinner table, in private conversation. From parent to child, from generation to generation, a different question, a different sentence, a completely different relationship with money. And today, I am going to tell you exactly what that sentence is, why it works, and how you can use it starting from today. Because by the end of this video, you will understand something about the Jewish approach to wealth that almost nobody in the outside world has ever been taught. Let us begin at the beginning. The Book of Proverbs, one of the most ancient texts in Jewish wisdom, contains a verse that Jewish parents have quoted to their children for thousands of years. Proverbs 18, verse 21. Death and life are in the power of the tongue. Read that again. Death and life in the power of the tongue, not in the power of your bank account, not in the power of your education, your connections, your neighborhood, or the family you were born into, the tongue. The ancient Jewish sages did not write this as poetry. They wrote it as a law of reality, a statement of how the universe actually operates. And for 3,000 years, Jewish families have taken this verse with extreme seriousness, especially when it comes to money. Because here is what the rabbis understood that modern psychology is only now beginning to confirm. The words you speak about money do not describe your financial reality. They create it. Let me say that again, because it is the most important thing you will hear in this video. The words you speak about money do not describe your financial reality. They create it. When you say, I can't afford it, you are not stating a fact. You are issuing a command. To your brain, to your subconscious, to every decision-making mechanism inside you, you are telling your mind, stop thinking, stop searching, stop solving. The answer is no. The door is closed, and your mind, obedient as it is, complies immediately. It stops looking for solutions. It stops noticing opportunities. It stops asking the creative, generative questions that produce wealth. And this is precisely why Jewish millionaires for 3,000 years have refused to say those words. Not because they always had enough money, but because they understood that saying those words would guarantee they never would. So what do they say instead? It is 4 words. 4 words that change everything. How can I afford it? That is the sentence. How can I afford it? Now, on the surface, that might seem like a small change. Almost trivial. You might be wondering, is the difference between I can't afford it and how can I afford it really that significant? The answer is, it is not just significant. It is the difference between poverty and wealth. Let me show you why. When you say, I can't afford it, your brain hears a full stop, a closed door. a finished conversation. The mind receives a declaration of defeat and it moves on. No solutions are generated. No creativity is activated. No opportunities are noticed. But when you say, "How can I afford it?" something completely different happens inside your mind. Your brain receives a question. And the human brain is biologically, physiologically incapable of leaving a question unanswered. The moment you ask how, your mind goes to work, automatically, involuntarily. It begins scanning your environment, your skills, your resources, your network, searching for an answer to the question you just asked. It finds connections you would have missed. It notices opportunities you would have walked past. It generates solutions you would never have considered. This is not mysticism. This is not wishful thinking. This is how the human brain actually functions. And 3,000 years before modern neuroscience could explain it, the Jewish sages knew it. They called it the principle of machshava, which means directed thought or intentional thinking. The idea that the direction of your mind determines the direction of your life. And nowhere is this more powerful or more dangerous than in your relationship with money. Let me take you back to 1890s New York City, the Lower East Side, one of the most densely populated, desperately poor neighborhoods in the entire world. Hundreds of thousands of Jewish immigrants arriving from Eastern Europe with almost nothing. No English, no connections, no savings, no formal education by Western standards. They arrived with less than almost any immigrant group before or after them, and within one generation, within the lifetimes of their own children, a disproportionate number of those families had built businesses, purchased property, sent their children to universities, and accumulated generational wealth. The non-Jewish world watched this and invented all kinds of explanations. They said it was because Jews were clannish, that they only did business with each other. They said it was because of their educational culture. They said many things, most of them wrong. Here is what they missed. Those Jewish families crammed 10 people into 2-room tenement apartments on Delancey Street, did not sit around saying we can't afford it. They sat around asking, how can we afford it? How can we afford to send the oldest one to school? How can we afford to open a small pushcart business? How can we afford to move to a slightly better neighborhood? How can we get from where we are to where we want to be? The question, relentlessly, obsessively asked, produced answers that scarcity thinking never could. Now let me tell you about a man named Julius Rosenwald, born in 1862 in Springfield, Illinois, the son of a Jewish immigrant clothes peddler. The family was not wealthy. They were not connected. They had no advantages that the outside world could see. But Julius Rosenwald grew up in a home where questions, not declarations of defeat, were the currency of conversation. As a young man, he partnered with Richard Warren Sears to build what would become Sears, Roebuck and Company, at one point the largest retailer in the world. By the early 1900s, Rosenwald was worth what would be billions of dollars in today's terms. But here is what most people do not know about Julius Rosenwald. He gave away more than $63 million during his lifetime, which by modern calculation exceeds $1 billion. He funded the construction of nearly 5,000 schools for black children across the American South at a time when the government refused to do so. He gave not because he had extra. He gave because, like all Jewish millionaires of his era, he had been raised to ask how instead of declaring, I can't. And the wealth that resulted from that habit of mind he saw as belonging not just to himself, but to his community and his world. This is not a coincidence. This is the pattern, repeated across every generation, every geography, every era of Jewish history. Ask how, not whether now I want to go deeper, because the sentence, how can I afford it, is powerful on its own. But the ancient Jewish sages taught something even more sophisticated than a single reframe. They taught that there are three languages of money, and that which language you speak determines which world you live in. The first language is the language of impossibility. This is the language of I can't afford it, of that's not for people like me, of money doesn't come easy, of rich people are just lucky. The Talmud has a name for this mindset, ayin hara, the evil eye. Not a supernatural curse as it is sometimes mistranslated, but the gaze of scarcity, the tendency to look at the world and see only what is missing, what is closed, what is impossible. The Talmud says, and I want you to hear this carefully, that the person who speaks the language of impossibility will attract exactly what they speak, not as magic, as mechanism, as the natural consequence of a mind trained to see closed doors everywhere it looks. The second language is the language of complaint. This is subtler and more dangerous because it sounds more reasonable. It is the language of I would, but of I could, if only, of someday when things change. In Jewish wisdom tradition, this language is called kvetching, constant complaining, constant lamenting. And the sages warned against it not merely as a social annoyance, but as a spiritual and financial poison, because the language of complaint trains your mind to see obstacles as permanent and your situation as someone else's fault. And a mind focused on whose fault things are cannot simultaneously be focused on how to fix them. The third language, the language that Jewish millionaires speak, is the language of questions. How can I afford it? What would need to be true for this to be possible? Who do I need to learn from to make this happen? What is one step I can take today? The Talmud in Tractat Berachot teaches a person is obligated to say, the world was created for my sake, not from arrogance, but from responsibility, from the deep conviction that your existence here is purposeful, and that purposeful existence includes the obligation to provide for yourself, your family, and your community. You cannot fulfill that obligation while speaking the language of impossibility. You cannot build wealth while your tongue is building walls. Now let me give you the mechanism, the actual psychological and neurological explanation for why this ancient Jewish wisdom is so powerfully correct. Modern neuroscience has a concept called the reticular activating system, the RAS. It is a network of neurons in your brainstem that acts as a filter for reality. Every second, your senses are processing 11 million bits of information. Your conscious mind can only handle approximately 40 bits at a time. The RAS decides which 40 bits you consciously notice. Everything else it discards. Here is the critical insight. Your RAS filters reality based on what your brain believes is important. And one of the most powerful signals that tells your RAS what is important is the questions you ask. When you ask, "How can I afford this?" you are programming your RAS to notice everything in your environment that is relevant to that question. Opportunities, solutions, connections, resources. They were there before. They were always there, but your brain was not programmed to see them because you were asking the wrong question. Or worse, you were making declarations instead of asking questions at all. When you say, "I can't afford it," your RAS hears, "This is not important." Stop scanning. When you say, "How can I afford it?" your RAS hears, "This is a priority." Begin scanning. Do not stop until you find an answer. The ancient Jewish sages did not have the vocabulary of neuroscience, but they understood the principle 3,000 years before the scientists did. Death and life are in the power of the tongue, because the tongue programs the mind, and the mind shapes reality. If this is changing the way you see things, I want to ask you for one thing right now. Subscribe to this channel, not because it helps me, though it does, but because what I am going to show you in the coming weeks goes much, much deeper than this. Every video on this channel is built on the same foundation, the ancient wisdom that Jewish families have kept private for thousands of years, and that you deserve to know. Hit subscribe. So the next lesson finds you. Now, let us talk about exactly how you apply this. Practically, starting today, the ancient Jewish approach to money language was not vague or philosophical. It was concrete and practiced. Here are the 3 specific shifts that Jewish millionaires have taught their children for generations. The first shift: replace the declaration with the question. Every time you catch yourself about to say, "I can't afford it," stop, physically stop, and replace it with, "How can I afford this?" You do not need to have the answer immediately. The question is the point, because the question, as we have discussed, starts the engine. The answer comes later. But the engine must start first. The Talmud teaches a concept called hishtadlut, which means human effort in partnership with divine providence. The idea that you must take the first step. You must ask the first question, and then through your own creativity, through the connections you make, through the opportunities you notice, the path begins to reveal itself. The path does not appear to those who stand still declaring impossibility. It appears to those who begin walking and asking. The second shift: speak differently about money in front of your children. This is perhaps the most important shift of all, because the generational wealth of Jewish families was not built in banks. It was built in kitchens and dining rooms, in the language that parents used in front of their children every single day. If your children hear you say, "We can't afford it," they learn that scarcity is the default, that closed doors are normal, that the correct response to financial challenge is resignation. If your children hear you ask, "How can we afford this? What are our options? Let us think about this together," they learn something completely different. They learn that every financial challenge is a problem to be solved, not a fate to be accepted. They learn that their minds are their most valuable financial assets. They learn to think like builders, not like victims. This is precisely how the Jewish families of the Lower East Side produced a generation of lawyers, doctors, scientists, and business owners within 30 years of arriving with nothing, not because of money they had, because of language they used. The third shift: ask better questions, not just different questions. How can I afford it is the beginning. But Jewish millionaires go further. They ask, what skill could I develop that would make this effortless to afford in 1 year? They ask, what relationship, if built today, could create the opportunity I need? They ask, what does the person who has this know, believe, and do that I do not yet know, believe, and do? These questions, trained as a daily habit, compound over time. The same way that financial investment compounds, the same way that generational wealth compounds. Because the questions you ask today determine the thoughts you think tomorrow. And the thoughts you think tomorrow determine the decisions you make next week. And the decisions you make next week determine the life you live in 10 years. This is not philosophy. This is arithmetic. Let me bring this full circle. 1,000 years ago, the Book of Proverbs declared, "Death and life are in the power of the tongue." For 3 millennia, Jewish families taught their children to take that verse with total seriousness in their relationship with money. Not to say, "I can't afford it." To ask, "How can I afford it?" Not to close the mind with declarations of impossibility, to open it with questions of possibility. The families who did this, generation after generation, built wealth that survived persecution, survived expulsion, survived the destruction of entire empires, not because they had more money than others, because they had a different relationship with the language of money. And here is the remarkable truth that I want to leave you with today. This is not a Jewish secret anymore. It never needed to be. The ancient sages did not hide this wisdom because they wanted to keep others poor. They preserved it because so few were willing to practice it, because it is uncomfortable to stop yourself in the middle of a financial difficulty and ask how. Instead of saying, "I can't," it requires discipline. It requires faith. Not necessarily religious faith, but the faith that your mind is capable of finding solutions that you cannot yet see. It requires you to treat your tongue as the powerful instrument that the ancient wisdom has always declared it to be. But here is what 3,000 years of evidence tells us. For those who practice it consistently, relentlessly, generation after generation, it works. It works not because it is magic. It works because questions produce answers, and answers produce action. And action, sustained, creative, question-driven action, produces wealth. The words, "I can't afford it," are 3 words that close a door. The words, "How can I afford it?" are 4 words that open the world. Choose your 4 words. I'm the hidden rabbi, and I will see you in the next one.